In the 1920s, a pilot crossing the Peruvian desert looked down from his cockpit and saw something that should not have existed. A condor, wings outstretched, carved into the earth beneath him, nearly 500 feet across, older than memory, invisible from the ground. For 2,000 years, no one knew why it was there. For 100 years, scientists fought over the answer. Aliens, astronomer priests, Olympic athletes, irrigation engineers, every theory collapsed under its own weight. The lines refused to give up their secret. That refusal is now ending. A 10-year study using drones, magnetometry, and excavations across more than 50,000 geoglyphs has finally cracked it. Hidden temples on the desert floor, sacrificial altars at the end of every path, and a 40-year drought that turned a civilization's last prayer into stone. If you're fascinated by how modern science is rewriting ancient mysteries, hit subscribe. The first aviators came through this part of Peru in the opening decades of the 20th century. Like so many other unexplored regions in those years, the country was opening up to the modern world from above for the first time. What those pilots saw on the desert floor below them did not fit anything they had been trained to expect. 100-foot man with piercing owl-like eyes, arms raised as if to beckon them down from a nearby hillside. The unmistakable visage of a whale more than 150 feet in length, a hummingbird with its wings outstretched, a fox, a spider, a monkey with a doubly wound spiral tail sprawled across the earth on a scale no human eye could take in from the ground, a condor nearly 500 feet wide, 2 gargantuan hands, between them only 9 fingers in total, a mighty tree, and so much more. Take a moment to consider what those pilots were actually seeing. These were not paintings on a wall. They were not carvings on a monument. They were figures on the scale of geographical features, etched directly into the surface of one of the driest landscapes on the planet. And they had been waiting there in silence for somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 years before anyone with the technology to view them properly arrived in the sky. Many, perhaps most, would not survive long enough to be properly recorded. By the time systematic study began in the 1930s, large numbers had already been lost to erosion, sand, and the steady creep of modern habitation. A colossal reptile, for example, had been cut neatly in two only a few years earlier by the construction of the Pan-American Highway, the engineers entirely unaware of what they were cutting through. Other figures could only be partially traced, their forms obscured by drifting sand or fragmented by roads and farmland. But survive they did. Today, scientists call them geoglyphs, and the ones found in this stretch of southern Peru are perhaps the most famous in all the world. The scale of what remains is genuinely difficult to absorb. In just one 30-mile section of desert near the modern town of Nazca, more than 800 straight lines and trapezoids have been meticulously recorded. They stretch for thousands of miles in total length, hewn directly into the gravel-coated pampa by the simple act of removing the dark volcanic topsoil to reveal the pinkish sand beneath. Many are so large they can only be properly viewed from the sky. Others, in their cleaned and restored state, remain visible from the high ground and natural vantage points scattered throughout the region. And yet the lines near Nazca are not even the full picture. Just as many figures are to be found in the neighboring Palpa Valley to the north. The full extent of the region containing the geoglyphs stretches for some 400 miles in total. These are only the lines that have survived. In areas more prone to flooding or where farming populations have remained continuous over the centuries, almost nothing is left. Just hints, just suggestions of wonders that may have once existed in the long millennia before Europeans ever set foot in South America. The setting itself is part of the story. The The land here is trapped between the towering range of the Andes and the open Pacific, locked into a weather system found nowhere else on Earth. Almost no rain falls. The few showers that do come are remembered as events. Life here had to get creative to survive, relying on coastal sea mist, sporadic mountain runoff, and rivers that filled their beds for only part of the year. And yet against the odds, or perhaps because of them, a people not only survived in this place, but thrived. They thrived long enough, and on a sophisticated enough scale, to carve 500-foot condors into a desert that almost never rained. For over 100 years, the question has remained the same. Who built them, and why? For 100 years, the theories ranged from the brilliant to the absurd, and almost none of them were right. The earliest researchers, working in the first half of the 20th century, treated the lines as a practical puzzle. They proposed irrigation channels, since water was so obviously the central concern of the region. They proposed roads, since the lines so clearly ran in determined directions across the landscape. They proposed cemeteries for the honored dead, ceremonial tracks for athletic competitions, and even kinship routes tying clan members to ancestral graves. In 1947, a German researcher named Hans Horkheimer published an entire book arguing for that last interpretation. Each theory captured a fragment of what the lines actually were. None of them captured the whole. Then came 1968. A Swiss writer named Erich von Däniken released a book called Chariots of the Gods, and Nazca was never quite the same again. The lines, in von Däniken's telling, had nothing to do with the people who built them, because in his view, those people had not been capable of building them. The geoglyphs, he argued, were expertly engineered landing strips for extraterrestrial visitors. The figures of spiders and monkeys and condors were signal markers. The trapezoids were runways. An entire civilization's most monumental achievement was reframed as the work of someone else entirely. The book sold tens of millions of copies. It made von Däniken famous. It also captured something dark and persistent about how the modern Western world looked at ancient indigenous cultures, particularly in the Americas. The assumption embedded in the alien theory was simple. These people could not have done this themselves. The response from those who actually knew the desert was withering. Maria Reiche, a German-born mathematician who had spent decades by that point walking the lines and mapping them by hand, was asked about the landing strip theory more times than she could count. She had a standard answer. She said she was afraid the spacemen would have gotten stuck. The Pampa, she pointed out, was not a hard runway. It was loose volcanic gravel over soft sand. And she had a further question. Why would interstellar travelers signal each other in the shape of spiders and monkeys? Logic, however, was not what von Däniken was selling. The book had already done its damage. The Peruvian authorities, alarmed by the flood of tourists arriving in search of alien runways and by the increasingly fringe nature of the international interest, responded by cracking down on foreign research. Bureaucratic walls went up. Permits became harder to obtain. The added scrutiny of public attention made serious archaeology at Nazca slower, more expensive, and less appealing to scholars who had careers to protect. Research stalled for decades. Reiche herself, by then known to the world as the Lady of Nazca, would spend the rest of her life on the Pampa. For more than 50 years, she rode the local bus out each morning, walked to whichever stretch of geoglyphs she was working on, ate a packed lunch in whatever shade she could find, and returned home in the evening to write. She cleaned the lines, she measured them, she mapped them on graph paper by candlelight. She held the entire project of preserving them together by force of personal will. Her theory, the one she would defend for decades, was that the lines were a vast astronomical calendar. She believed they aligned with the rising and setting of the sun, the moon, and certain key stars throughout the year. It was an elegant idea, anchored in her training as a mathematician and in the broader assumption of the time that ancient societies had been ruled by priest astronomers. She was wrong. Most of the lines, it would later turn out, have no consistent astronomical alignment at all. But to understand what the lines actually are, what they were really used for, and why the people who made them invested so much of themselves in their creation, we have to look first at those people themselves, a civilization almost no one outside Peru has ever heard of. Long before the lines, there was a civilization that had already learned how to grow corn in a desert that almost never rained. They are called the Paracas, named for the windswept peninsula on the southern Peruvian coast, where their remains were first uncovered by the legendary Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello in 1927. The Paracas emerged around 800 BC, which is to say nearly 1,000 years before anyone we now call Nazca ever existed. They lived where the desert meets the ocean, in a thin ribbon of fertility sustained by sea mist, fishing, and the rivers descending from the distant Andes. They built the foundations of everything that followed. Their textiles are widely regarded as the finest in the entire pre-Columbian Americas. Woven in colors that have survived intact for more than 2,000 years, preserved by the dry heat of the desert, they depict the same animals and supernatural figures that would later be carved into the pampa on a scale visible from the sky. Birds, cats, flying serpents, humanoids with the features of beasts. The Paracas were also the first to experiment with placing art directly onto the landscape itself. Rock carvings, hillside drawings, and early geoglyphs have been documented at sites like Chichictara, with some figures dating as early as 800 BC. The famous candelabra on the cliffs of the Paracas Peninsula, three-pronged and over 600 feet tall, belongs to this same tradition. Then the climate began to turn. By around 500 BC, the rainfall along the Peruvian coast had been steadily declining for centuries, and the Paracas began to move. They followed the river valleys inland, pushing east into the Ica, the Nazca, the Pisco, and the Rio Grande drainages, searching for fresh soil and reliable water further from the increasingly desiccated coast. They brought their textiles with them. They brought their iconography with them. They brought their habit of inscribing the landscape with sacred imagery with them. By around 100 BC, the descendants of those migrating Paracas had become something new. We call them the Nazca. What the Nazca built in those river valleys was an engineering achievement that still functions today. They are called puquios, and they are spiral aqueducts carved into the earth that tap into underground water sources and channel them to the surface for redistribution. Several have been restored in recent decades. Many are still in use by local farmers in the 21st century, more than 1,500 years after they were dug. To create a working aqueduct system in one of the driest deserts on Earth, in a society without iron tools, is not the work of a primitive people. It is the work of a culture that understood its environment with a precision that modern hydrologists have only recently begun to appreciate, and their RT, by every available measure, matched their engineering. Nazca polychrome pottery, decorated in as many as 11 colors fired into the clay, is some of the most magnificent ceramic work produced anywhere in the ancient Americas. Cup-shaped bowls, flaring dishes, bottles with twin spouts and connecting bridges, each one painted with animals and supernatural figures rendered in a style so distinctive that any archaeologist trained in the period can recognize Nazca work at a glance. And here is where the entire alien theory finally collapses on its own. The motifs painted on Nazca pottery and woven into Nazca textiles are stylistically identical to the figures carved into the desert. The spider on the pot is the same spider on the pampa. The monkey on the textile is the same monkey scaled up across a hillside. The condor, the killer whale, the hummingbird, the supernatural humanoid with the staring eyes. These were not images dropped from the sky. They were the recurring vocabulary of a single coherent culture, drawn on cloth, painted on clay, and inscribed across the land on a scale large enough to be seen by their gods. The mystery of who built the lines is not really a mystery anymore. The real question is why. When American archaeologists first stumbled onto it in the 1920s, they thought they had found a lost city. The site sits on the desert fringe just south of the Nazca River, sprawling for miles across the parched earth, dominated by the unmistakable silhouettes of pyramids built from sun-dried mud brick. When the American traveler William Curtis Farabee and his team began clearing away the centuries of accumulated sand in the early 20s, what emerged seemed extraordinary. Row upon row of building blocks, plazas, ceremonial mounds, a scale of construction that, by every standard then applied to ancient American sites, demanded the label of urban center. They called it Cahuachi, the place of the seers, and for the next 30 years, that was what it remained in the academic record. A city. In 1952, the American archaeologist William Duncan Strong conducted the first systematic excavation of the site. His conclusions reinforced the original interpretation. Kahuachi, he argued, was almost certainly the preeminent urban center of the entire Nazca region. A capital, a seat of political power, a place where thousands of people had lived, worked, traded, and governed for centuries. The interpretation held through the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s. It was the consensus. By the 1980s, a new generation of archaeologists looked at the same evidence and reached a completely different conclusion. The lead figure in that reassessment was the American archaeologist Helene Silverman, and what she found in her excavations did not match the picture of a city at all. There were no domestic structures, there were no signs of permanent neighborhoods, there were no ordinary cooking pots, no everyday refuse pits, no scatter of the small, unglamorous debris that thousands of years of urban life inevitably leaves behind. What she did find was something stranger. Roughly 70% of the pottery recovered from Kawachi was high-status polychrome ware, not the kind used for daily meals, and chemical analysis suggested that almost none of it had been made there. The pots had been brought in from elsewhere, carried across the desert by visitors, and then deliberately smashed against the ground as part of the ceremonies taking place. The food remains told the same story. Vegetables, grain, llama bones, alpaca bones, all preserved in the heat of the desert sun. None of it had been stored. All of it had been brought to the site and consumed almost immediately in quantities that suggested mass feasting on specific occasions rather than continuous habitation. Then the supporting discoveries began to accumulate. A specialized circular oven, built for preparing food on a ceremonial scale, with the remains of corn and edible plants still preserved inside. Fragments of panpipes and drums, combs and elite textiles. A large ceramic vessel of the type used throughout the Andes for brewing chicha, the sacred fermented drink consumed during religious festivals. And, most tellingly of all, the remains of San Pedro cactus, a hallucinogen not native to the Nazca Valley, which had to have been carried in from distant regions specifically for ritual use. Cahuachi was not a city. It never had been. It was a Vatican, a Mecca, a Stonehenge, a pilgrimage center maintained year-round by a small handful of resident priests, and then swelling to many thousands of visitors at certain festival times in the agricultural calendar. People came from across the region, brought their finest pottery, smashed it on the ground as an offering, drank chicha, consumed sacred cactus, played music, ate meat that had been ritually prepared, and then went home, and they brought their dead with them. Kawachi was also a necropolis. Burials have been recovered from across the site, and among them are the so-called trophy heads, mummified with black hair often still visible, the foreheads pierced with carrying ropes. They almost certainly served as agricultural offerings. Sacrifices were made to ensure the growth of corn in a land that could lose its harvest to a single dry year. Kawachi explained who gathered in the desert and what they did when they gathered, but it could not explain the lines themselves. In the late 1990s, a German archaeologist named Markus Reindel began assembling a team that would eventually conduct the most ambitious study ever undertaken on the Nazca Lines. Working with his Peruvian colleague Johny Isla of the Universidad de San Marcos, Reindel chose to focus not on Nazca itself, made famous by Maria Reiche, but on the neighboring Palpa Valley to the north. Less studied, less contaminated by tourism. Just as significant, by the early 2000s, the project had grown into something genuinely unprecedented. An interdisciplinary collaboration drawing in researchers from Peru, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Archaeologists, chemists, geologists, drone operators, computer scientists. They would dedicate more than 10 years to the work, surveying over 650 settlement sites and combining traditional excavation with digital methods to map and record more than 50,000 geoglyphs. The first surprise came from the air itself. A substantial part of the project involved flying drones over the lines to construct a detailed three-dimensional model of the entire valley. When the team layered topographical data onto that model, something became clear that had been obvious to anyone walking the Pampa for centuries, but had somehow been missed in the alien runway debate. The lines were not visible from the ground. Anyone walking them, anyone performing ceremonies on them, would have been easily visible from the neighboring hillsides and natural plateaus. The geoglyphs were never built only for the sky. They were built for human witnesses, for crowds of them. The second surprise came from the dirt. Reindel's team had spotted, on the aerial models, a series of small circular mounds appearing at the beginnings and ends of many of the great trapezoids. When they began excavating those mounds, they uncovered stone platforms. They uncovered post holes more than half a meter deep, where wooden masts had once stood. They uncovered the scattered remains of offerings piled on top of the platforms and left to the sun. Smashed pottery, guinea pigs, crayfish, corn, llama bones brought down from the Andes, and, most telling of all, spondylus shells carried from waters thousands of kilometers away. Spondylus, the universal Andean symbol of water and fertility. These were not decorative mounds. They were altars, hidden in plain sight at the entrance and exit of every major geoglyph. The lines were not pictures. They were ritual terrain. The Pampa was not a canvas. It was a temple. The third surprise came from magnetometry. By 2011, the team had built up sufficiently detailed scans of the geoglyphs themselves to begin asking a different question. Not what the lines looked like, but how they had been used. The magnetometric data was unambiguous. The surfaces of the lines and figures had been walked on repeatedly over generations by enormous numbers of people. The soil beneath them was packed down to a degree that the surrounding undisturbed Pampa was not. The lines were trails, pathways, sacred roads, and every geoglyph, when examined carefully, had an entrance and an exit. The spirals were not spiral images. They were continuous walking paths, leading inward to the center and then back outward to the edge, like a child tracing a pencil across a page without ever lifting it from the paper. The American anthropologist Anthony Aveny of Colgate University had suggested decades earlier that the lines were connected to water and the local springs. Reindel's data proved him right. The geoglyphs were oriented not toward the stars, but toward the direction of water flowing into the Nazca drainage system. Many pointed directly to the position of the sun on the horizon at the beginning of the rainy season, and the animals chosen for the largest figures were precisely the ones associated with water in Andean cosmology. Spiders, whose webs gathered the morning dew. Whales, creatures of the sea. Monkeys, inhabitants of the wet forests beyond the mountains. Condors, whose descent to the coast meant rain was falling in the Andes above. The Nazca did not draw on the desert. They prayed on it. Every line was a sentence. Every geoglyph was a prayer for rain. And for 1,000 years, the gods answered. And then, in the 7th century, the rain stopped. The first warning had come 200 years earlier. Somewhere between 400 to 450 AD, an exceptional El Niño event struck the Peruvian coast, dumping an entire year of rainfall on Cahuachi in a matter of weeks. The desert pyramids, built from sun-dried mud brick on the assumption that significant rain would never come, were not engineered for that kind of inundation. An earthquake may have struck at roughly the same time, compounding the damage. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the great pilgrimage center was devastated. By the middle of the 5th century, Cahuachi had been abandoned for good. The culture itself, however, did not end. It changed. With the central temple gone, the people of the region turned more desperately than ever to the only sacred ground they had left: the Pampa itself. The largest and most monumental trapezoids in the entire Nazca region date to the centuries after Kawachi fell. The most ambitious geoglyphs of all, the ones that required the most labor and the most coordination, were constructed during the final phase of the civilization, not at its height. It is a pattern seen at the end of many ancient civilizations. The grandest monuments come last. They are not signs of triumph. They are signs of frantic effort. The archaeological record from this period carries that same edge of desperation. Newer geoglyphs were placed directly on top of older ones, breaking the careful spatial rules that had governed line construction for centuries. Trophy heads multiplied in the burial record, suggesting an uptick in warfare, raiding, and pressure between communities that had previously coexisted in relative peace. Whatever cohesion had held Nazca society together during its great pilgrimage age was beginning to fray under environmental strain. And then the strain became catastrophe. The climate models, reconstructed in part from the immense quantity of data gathered by Reindel and Isla's project, tell the story with brutal clarity. Beginning in the 7th century, a drought settled over the Nazca region that did not lift for roughly 40 years. No significant rain, no significant rivers flowing down from the Andes. For an entire generation, the water did not come. The Puquios, the ingenious underground aqueducts that had sustained Nazca agriculture through every dry stretch the desert had thrown at them, could not compensate for a sky that had simply stopped giving anything back. Crops failed. Stored food ran out. Disease followed. By around 600 AD, RAD, dating from settlement sites across the region, confirms that abandonment had become widespread. Houses emptied, villages went quiet. The survivors gathered what they could carry and fled inland toward the Andes, becoming refugees in the highlands of a country that had not been theirs. By the middle of the 7th century, the Nazca culture, as a coherent way of life, had effectively ceased to exist. The people who remained understandably lost their faith in the old gods. Whatever rituals had been performed on the Pampa for the previous 1,000 years could no longer be defended. The prayers had been offered, the offerings had been made, the lines had been walked, danced, swept clean, repaired, rebuilt, and walked again. And the rain had still stopped. No new geoglyphs were ever made. The civilization that had carved a 500-foot condor into the desert took its secrets with it into the mountains, and the desert closed over what they left behind. The final chapter came 900 years later with the Spanish. By the time the conquistador Pedro Chiesa de Leon wrote his account of the conquest of Peru in 1553, he was already describing the aftermath of an extinction. He noted that the indigenous population of almost every coastal valley had collapsed within 2 decades of European arrival, killed by disease, killed by violence, killed in the brutal civil wars between rival factions of Spaniards fighting over the spoils. Whatever fragmentary memory of the Nazca Lines might still have survived in oral tradition died in those decades. The lines were left to the wind and the sand, and to no one who knew what they were for. Today, a visitor flying over the Peruvian desert can see what those first aviators saw 100 years ago. The condor still spreads its wings across 500 feet of stone and sand. The spider, the monkey, the hummingbird, all still there, scraped into a landscape that has barely changed in 2,000 years. What has changed is that we finally know who put them there and why. The Nazca built their cathedrals in the dirt. They walked them in single file, generation after generation, kin group after kin group, asking the only God who mattered to them for the only thing they could not survive without. For 100 years, we asked who the lines were drawn for. The answer was always the sky. The Nazca did not draw the desert. They wrote a prayer in it. And when the rain finally stopped, the prayer was all that was left.